Good afternoon, and thank you for taking some time to join us here today for our HireRight webinar series. I appreciate all of the time that each of you is willing to spend with us, recognizing that absolutely everybody is pressed for time at this point in the year. Today, we want to present to you a conversation around back to the basics. Commercial driver post-hire screening best practices. Now, as we get into the conversation today, let me make sure that I am clear that this is not legal advice, nor is it consulting advice. Please engage your own legal counsel and your own internal resources to ensure that anything you do here today is going to fit within the framework of your organization, as well as within the framework of your customers' expectations. That being said, we do have a lot of good content today. But before we get to the content, allow me to point out a couple of key elements of this process that we'll be engaged with on this platform. You'll notice there is a menu bar with red buttons. They are fairly intuitive. First of all, we'll point out the clipboard in the center. This is HireRight resources, and any resources we may reference would be listed here for your ability to download. Secondly, if you would like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A button, and we will engage that question as time permits within the allotted hour here. There's a survey button as well. That's on the far right side. It's a little pencil with a piece of paper. Please do take the survey. This session that we're having here today is a direct result of information that we received from previous surveys that came to us. So the information that you provide to us at the end of today's session will help us tremendously as we look into the new year. Finally, the audio controls button allows you to obviously control your audio, and should you have any problems with the presentation, perhaps if it is not advancing along with the rest of us, utilize the F5 button on your keyboard as the initial way to refresh the presentation. Now, we will be offering the HRCI and the SHRM credit. That information will come to you in email tomorrow so that you can apply for that accordingly. Now that you've heard me for a few moments, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Justin Reed, and for the last 21 years, I have served HireRight in various different roles, currently as the manager of transportation solutions, which includes strategic alliances and partnerships here at HireRight. It is my pleasure to have your attention here today as we go through the subjects. So, let's get started. Federal regulations are really where we're going to start this conversation, because when we look at ongoing screening, what we're really focused on here today is not pre-employment. Pre-employment gets almost all the attention in the industry, and rightfully so. Obviously, it's a very dynamic environment. It's very complicated to keep everything rolling as we're trying to onboard drivers and get them qualified to get into seats. But once we have them in that spot, our obligations for regulatory compliance don't end. So the first part of the conversation today is about the regulatory elements that you really need to be ensuring are in place within your safety culture, within your driver environment. We're going to talk about the MVR review, some medical certification issues, drug and alcohol clearinghouse, and of course, our favorite, random drug and alcohol screening. Now, I've given you a reference on each one of these screens, the reference being the actual location that you can find the regulatory citation on this particular subject. I actually encourage you to take note of that. One of the things as you continue to develop in your career in the in the transportation space is to become familiar with these regulations. They do come up pretty often, and when you're able to essentially know where to look for qualification on that, then you can go and read it for yourself. And I have found in my career that's extremely helpful to be able to know where to look for these details. There are all kinds of resources out on the internet, from the FMCSA's site, which has actually been designed quite well. I have to give them kudos, to some private sites that are driven by law firms, or there's a site out there. It's kind of like Wikipedia, but for legal issues, and they've got a tremendously excellent breakdown of these federal regulations in that environment. So keep that in mind if you want to study up. Now, the first thing we want to talk about is the annual MVR review. This is probably something you're fairly familiar with, but it's absolutely crucial that we discuss this. And I have several things that come up throughout the presentation pertaining to this. As the regulation states, this is a review into each driver's MVR for at least every 12 months. Now, you are certainly welcome to look at an MVR more often, but you are obligated to look at that for your existing drivers every 12 months. And during that process, you're going to need to be reviewing it. Obviously, that there are no citations or elements that are present in that record that would disqualify them from safety sensitive duty or disqualify them based on your corporate policy to be able to continue to operate your commercial motor vehicle. One of the things that I might encourage here is, how are you obtaining these MVRs? Because this is one of those elements in the sort of life cycle of a safety professional that becomes really quite burdensome as your fleet grows. How do you keep track of what MVR is essentially up for review, and how do you order multiple MVRs without it being a exercise in multiple points and clicks? I put in a caveat note here saying, consider utilizing a batch uploading tool. So if you're a HireRight customer, please inquire to us about what that means, because we do have fantastic batch uploading capabilities that would allow you to essentially submit orders for multiple drivers' MVRs all at one time, and that would significantly streamline your overall process. So once we move on from this annual MVR, let's move on to the next subject. This is the driver medical certificate. Now, in the pre-employment environment, the driver cert is certainly a key element of ensuring the driver is even able to be qualified. But this is one of those things that I want you to pay quick attention to. And if you've been doing this very long, you certainly know this. And if you're new to the industry, this is a really key element. The driver medical certification is something that can very quickly sneak up on an organization and be an expired document that you may not have paid attention to. The medical certificate can be issued in various increments of time based upon, in essence, the general health of that driver. So when you look at the physical evaluation that is done, the evaluation of their vision and hearing and so forth, as I have listed here, these things play into whether or not that driver has a longer capacity to be qualified. Also, keep in mind who has to have this updated. And you've noticed that I put some bullet points on the screen. First of all, when you are employing a commercial motor vehicle operator and they are operating any equipment that exceeds the 10,000-pound gross vehicle weight rating, this would be in combination or standalone. This component of requiring the driver medical certification is in place. So that renewal has to be done and kept in file, which we'll talk about a little bit later. There's also the component pertaining to passenger transport. So the passenger transport is one of those scenarios where if you are operating within the regulatory requirement for the amount of people that can be in a particular vehicle, then this is at play, and then hazardous materials as well. So regardless of the size of the vehicle, the gross vehicle weight rating, if you're placarded for hazardous materials, the medical cert is required. So let's look a little bit further at that. Take a look at the screen here in front of you. There's too much here for me to read to you, but when you look at the key elements of what is being evaluated, these are things where, as drivers go through different stages of their own health, they can improve, they can become less positive for a driver, and that's going to impact whether or not that driver can receive a maximum of 2 years on their medical certification, or perhaps even a lesser amount of time. In general, we see the shortest length being about 6 months. and any sort of posting in between there is possible based upon the particular opinion of the medical professional that is conducting this evaluation. So when we look at vision, there's some specifics that are called out here. Hearing, obviously, again, some specifics. Blood pressure, and then the urinalysis is generally misunderstood. Please keep in mind that this urinalysis is pertaining to key health components. This is not a substitute for a random drug test. This is a urinalysis for medical purposes alone. Let's talk a little bit about the FMCSA Clearinghouse. This is another one of the mandated ongoing screening processes. This one can get a bit confusing because once you've employed a driver, you still have an obligation to conduct a query into the Clearinghouse on an annual basis. And that query can actually be in some different flavors based upon your desire to engage the process. The requirement for ongoing Clearinghouse queries is that you do what is called a limited query annually. The limited query is essentially a ping against the federal database that is looking to see if there is anything that has been posted about that driver in that database. And if there indeed is information that is in that database, then it will, in order to return to you that new information, we'll have to move from a limited query to a full query. Now, if you want to run a full query on every driver on an annual basis, or even more often if you're so inclined, you're welcome to do so. Why you probably won't is the consent process. You see, with a limited query, the consent is what we call evergreen or automatic, meaning that the driver is not going to be required to engage the clearinghouse platform to give their consent. With a full query, that driver has to grant consent to that data each and every time that that data is collected. So if you're doing that annually, that can produce a fairly substantial burden to that driver. It would not even necessarily result in you getting any better data. Because like I said previously, if you do that limited query and there is information, it's going to prompt you to go ahead and have the driver grant consent so that you can get the full query and then collect the appropriate new information that has been posted. I've put into our presentation here today a kind of a cycle here. Now, the reason I brought this up is how HireRight engages in that query process involves what's called a 12-month look back. And to break it down, and this is, take a look at the screen, try to digest that fairly quickly. But in essence, what I'm saying here in this diagram is the process that HireRight has built to engage the clearinghouse allows us to monitor when consent is or is not given so that we can notify the employer and help to engage that driver differently to get them to access that and give us that consent when we're dealing with a full query. There's also the 12-month look back, which means that anytime that a new violation might appear in the next 12 months. So if I run a full query today, I've got kind of a 12-month rolling process there that says, okay, and anytime in the next 12 months something pops up, you're going to get a notification. And that notification won't necessarily be the information, but it will let you know, hey, something's here. You may want to go ahead and look at it. And then, of course, you can have HireRight help you engage the clearinghouse to extract that new information so that you're not kept unaware. Sort of like allowing you to have confidence that even though the regulation says every 12 months you have to review this with a limited query, it's saying, we've kind of got you covered with a safety net during that time in case something else pops up. So you can restart that each year when you do that required annual query. This brings up drug and alcohol, the random process, which is the final thing I'm going to talk about here with regard to the mandated screening components. This is a subject that gets a lot of attention, folks. So when you start looking at the reality of the complexity of running a random program, many of you out there have this experience of when you have so many drivers, how do we keep this going, and how do we make sure that we comply with the 49 CFR 382 elements? So let's look at what those are. Let's look at some best practices and how you can hopefully make this less painful for your daily activities. First of all, I want to reiterate this. I've been saying this thing and about this for 20 years. Your selection has to be made in a scientifically valid random process. Now, I've been talking about this for a long time, and when I started long ago, it was really common to talk to people who put names in a hat, kind of drew names from non-scientifically valid processes. This is where having a third party involved is really quite crucial, because they are your double check to make sure that each driver has an equal chance of being selected in each draw. Undoubtedly, if you have some drivers who think that you're picking on them because they've been selected more than once in the course of a year, and that is not the case, and that is verifiable when you are utilizing this scientifically valid method that I've discussed previously. So each and every time a selection is made, all of those drivers' names are in the hat. Just because you got pulled in quarter number 1 does not mean you can't be pulled in quarter number 2. And then, of course, the final bullet point on this screen, immediate testing upon notification. Now, if you look into the 382 regulations, there's a subpart in there that defines this immediate testing, but it's extraordinarily vague. Immediate testing means that all actions past the point of notification for that driver are to be focused on having that drug or alcohol screening completed. If you come to me and you say, hey, Justin, you've been selected, and I tell you, okay, I've got it, I'll get in there tomorrow, or hey, after I deliver this load, I'll get in there, we're going to step outside of the realm of immediate testing per the regulatory definition. This, of course, is why, as a manager of the program, you're going to be cautious about when you actually make those notifications happen, because you are then sort of under, and not a clock, but you're under a rather stretchy component of the regulation there that's hard to define. So you need to play it very carefully and ensure you are getting that driver into that collection site as quickly as possible. So random program management is something that is really a key element of this. First of all, as your organization grows, you might add terminals, you might be adding a lot of drivers. There undoubtedly is going to become more complexity required within your organization. And this is one of the things that I see happening, where organizations that are growing tend to react to this a little bit too slowly, and they only start to engage this process once they have really become sort of overwhelmed with the random selection process. And that is creating multiple random pools. As you grow, you need to consider breaking up your driver environment in such a way that it allows your managers to have a more cohesive way to manage their set of drivers. Also, consider a platform or a system that's going to help you automate those draws. I already went over that. But the overall simplification of that administration process is really crucial, especially when you consider how are you going to get those drivers notified? How are you going to get them then set up for the appropriate collection site environments as well. So if you want to know more about that, you certainly have any generic question about what you might be looking for in a vendor or what HireRight does specifically, we're happy to engage you with that. And then the last bullet point that I have here, we've put in here, grant or revoke random permission controls. Now, what does this really mean? This is as you have administration personnel within your organization, either growing, and so you're adding people, or somebody leaves and they need to be withdrawn from that position. This can be really something that can be difficult to accomplish. So whatever your evaluation process is, ensure that you've considered that. Just put that on your checklist, that you know how that's going to work, and it's easy enough for you to find it to be useful to your process. Sort of a cousin to the random selection is the post-accident or reasonable suspicion testing. I've given your citations here. There are a few other elements. You might want to look at those and kind of read through them. But in essence, the post-accident testing. So there are some very specific qualifiers for what triggers the need for post-accident drug testing, drug and alcohol testing within the space of FMCSA regulated drivers. Go to the regulation. Please do read it. You're going to find that if you're in a situation where your driver has been obviously involved with a fatality, we would recognize that. So the fatality situation is always going to require drug and alcohol post-accident testing. If there's a situation where somebody has been removed from the scene via ambulance, same is going to apply. And then the little bit more nebulous component is if there is equipment that is damaged in the accident, and that equipment must be removed via a tow truck. In that scenario, that also is going to trigger the post-accident testing protocols. Now, that one's a little bit weird because sometimes there'll be really minor damage to a vehicle, and if that vehicle could have left the scene on its own power, it's a functioning vehicle. There was some paint that got scraped, there was a little fender bender, the vehicle drives fine, and they're like, well, we have to have it towed away. That isn't a trigger for the post-accident testing, all right? The trigger is that the vehicle is not capable of operating under its own capacity any further and must be towed away. So when we switch gears over to reasonable suspicion, this is probably one of those components that you are least prepared to engage in. And I could do a whole hour. Well, I could literally do 2 hours on this pretty easily, because per the regulation, any supervisor that might be making an observation with regard to impairment of one of your drivers would need to have gone through the 382.603 training requirements for a supervisor to make those observations and then subsequently document those observations. I suggest that you connect with the various supervisors in your organization and ensure that you have documentation proving that they've been through some sort of 382.603 training. Again, if you do find this happening, you're thrust into a reasonable suspicion scenario, you believe somebody is under the influence, you must take action. And that action is prescribed quite distinctly during that training process. And then, of course, you need to be able to prove that you've had that in order to satisfy anybody's curiosity in the future. All right, let's move on. So at this point, the gears are going to shift a little bit. I'm going to talk about the ongoing screening processes that would be more optional. These are not codified under regulation per se. They are good practices. They are good ideas. And we certainly want to discuss, why would you do these things, and sort of how do they also fit into some of those required components. I got a notification here. One of our listeners has indicated that I failed to mention something, and thank you. This is the beauty of working with people who are so good at their jobs, because back here, when I was talking about the post-accident elements, I forgot the key thing, which is to have a citation involved as well. Citation, yes. Thank you very much for bringing that up, because that is a key element. If you have a citation that is issued when someone is injured or there's a vehicle that's being towed away, then in that scenario, that citation is indeed a key element for that post-accident testing. Now, talking here about some of these things going on, I'm going to talk to you first about MVR monitoring. Let's just jump into that. Earlier, I mentioned, obviously, the MVR requirement, which is a 12-month review. And that 12-month review leaves you with a lot of potential for exposure during that time. It's likely you have been exposed to the idea of MVR monitoring. This is a complex, yet probably the top growth element in our FMCSA space today with regard to screening is setting up an MVR monitoring system. So how does that work? First of all, there is a fair amount of confusion, maybe general trepidation about, does the MVR monitoring replace the annual MVR requirement? And the answer to that is yes and no, because there are some states that have indicated that this can serve as a substitute to the 12-month review, and there's some states that haven't. Now, I'm not going to go over those states today. It is certainly something that's dynamically changing as different entities get involved in essentially coming up to those requirements. But that is something you'd want to consider based upon your location. Even with that being the case, MVR monitoring is, like I said, it's the hottest topic out there and has quickly moved into a position where it will be hard to explain why you don't do this when so many of your peers have started doing this. So again, the exposure is, we've got 12 months in between MVR reviews. Anything can happen during that time. Monitoring really closes that loop and allows you to have a much tighter control over those drivers that are on the road. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, about MVR monitoring is there's a general perspective that it means you're in a real-time monitoring situation. That's not really accurate. MVR monitoring means that each state is going to update MVR data based upon the cadence that they have selected. Some states are able to update, an adjudication to the record the next day after something has, a conviction has been posted or some sort of action has been taken against that record. Some states upload that stuff at the end of the month. Some states are still not even figured out what they're doing. So when you're involved in a monitoring process, it's really important to recognize that not every state is going to be giving you that information at the same time frame as another state may. Another thing that's important with many MVR monitoring environments is you do have to start off with what they call a baseline MVR. So let's say you employ 100 drivers today, and of those 100 drivers, you're going to start a monitoring program. How would we know where to start with them? Well, you'd have to start with a baseline MVR. That's kind of how it has been in this industry. I see some changes coming along in that environment as well, but that baseline MVR is sometimes necessary, so consider that. You can see here to provide the types of alerts that can be provided. So that information obviously is crucial for you to know as quickly as possible with regard to your safety culture. I wanted to bring up MVR adjudication. This is something you probably haven't thought much about. And this is sort of maybe in lieu of a monitoring program, or perhaps even It would serve very well on the front end in a pre-employment program, but it also can serve very well in an annual MVR program. And so MVR adjudication essentially says we have certain standards for what we're going to accept, what we won't accept when we review an MVR. When we apply the adjudication standards, it allows you to actually customize that information for your particular organization. What are your standards? So at HireRight, for instance, we can apply those specific standards to the MVR. When that MVR comes through our system, it will be screened automatically through those standards, and you'll be receiving then essentially a flag that'll let you know, hey, this meets your standards or this requires your review. And in that situation, you can come in and review the MVR, determine whether or not you're going to clear that out or what action you're going to take. The complexity of MVR adjudication is that the setup requires you to put in a fair amount of thought. However, I think it's really good thought for you to do as an exercise for understanding what are you going to accept. If that's at all vague, then going through an exercise like this to set up those standards will clear up that confusion or make it much more solid for you. So even though it would take a little effort on the front end, I would highly suggest that this would be an avenue that you can follow to increase your general awareness of what you're going to accept. Public records is a subject that has so many different aspects to it. Now, a lot of carriers, employers in general, like to do criminal background checks at the pre-employment level. This subject here is hardly used at all in this FMCSA space, but I think that it really needs to be considered as a next level activity. We've seen, the Clearinghouse come on board with the ability to keep a fresh eye on those kinds of risk. We've seen MVR monitoring come on board, again, helping us to contain risk in a much more tight time frame. Now, what I believe is really the next thing to start coming on is this criminal environment with regard to your driver pool, the driver population that is currently employed. So if you screen that driver on the front end before they start working for you, fantastic. You're going to make that screening based upon the risk tolerance that you have and the types of risk that you are engaged in. So are you hauling, high value materials that might be subject to potential theft? Are you dealing with the general public or private homes or anything of that nature that might indeed put you in contact with people that would create more risk for you? Those kinds of scenarios are a great reason to be doing criminal screening on the front end. But how many of us actually think about, once that driver's been on board with us for a while, checking that criminal record periodically or even having it monitored? If you feel your risk tolerance was, sensitive enough on the front end to be doing that screening, then I want to encourage you to look into it as an ongoing process. You can do an annual rescreen, every 2 years rescreen. You can be very specific in how that rescreen is done to control your costs, very specific in the type of criminal background check that you're looking for. So that is also, something that you have a great deal of customization in. It doesn't have to cost very much. There is something that we do called criminal monitoring, and criminal monitoring is essentially just like MVR monitoring. This might indeed be the way you go to cover as much of your population as possible with a great deal of consistency. My desire here in this conversation is to get you to consider this. What is your risk tolerance? Have you worked through this? And at the end of the day, if there's a driver that you were to discover out there that had a violation that would have disqualified them before you hired them? Would it not send chills down your spine to have them employed with you and have it disqualify them? But you only find out about that if you are somehow implicated into the situation. So again, this is a totally optional, but a growing field for this industry. This isn't a background check per se. This isn't a one of those things that really fits into either of my categories that I was going into, but it's such a hot topic for us here at HireRight. I feel like it's relevant to bring this up because it's really what brings all of these post-employment requirements together, as well as all of the pre-employment requirements. And that's what's going on with your driver qualification file. So under the 391.51 regulations, there's a lot of specifics with regard to how your DQ file is to be constructed. The second hottest topic in the space right now is creating and moving away from paper or internal DQ management processes to digital third-party DQ management processes with robust dashboards, notifications, and integrations that allow you to easily order those post-employment updates and easily monitor anything that expires so that you do not find yourself in a situation of being unaware. If you are still using paper, it's very difficult to be aware of anything that's expiring. If you're using an in-house system that was built on Excel spreadsheets, you're in a similar boat. So there are many different vendors in the space right now that are approaching this subject. There's a few that do it really well. And I think a key component of this is to understand how will the dashboard monitor your next step with keeping that driver qualified, and are there integrations in place that allow you to have the flexibility to be able to go in and actually order those reports, order those MedCert updates, and so forth. So these are the components that HireRight's involved in with regard to keeping those drivers qualified from a element of regulatory compliance, as well as best practices or best ideas in the marketplace right now. Now, I've noticed that we have a number of questions, so I'll try to work through some of these questions and see if we could come up with any answers. All right, so one of the questions is pertaining to, is this only for CDL drivers, or do we have to do this for all our drivers, even driving a pickup truck? And this is a fantastic question. So there's several answers to this question pertaining on with regard to which particular element of our conversation today are we really dealing with. So pickup trucks oftentimes can be very confusing. Pickup trucks can be anything from an F-150 all the way up to something like an F-450, or even I think there's an F-650 now. These things can look like pickup trucks. They obviously get bigger, but they very easily can exceed that 10,000 pound gross vehicle weight rating. Now, if your personnel are driving an F-150, that's not going to qualify alone. However, if they do connect a trailer and your combined vehicle combination weights exceed 10,000 pounds or exceed 26,001 pounds, you start to get into requirements for those various elements for random drug testing, all the elements we talked about in the 391 and 382 components earlier that are required. So to answer the question, does your pickup truck qualify? It depends. When you start to look at things like driver MVR monitoring, you would be monitoring it differently if it was only a driver of an F-150 pickup and they weren't towing anything. It would be a different level of monitoring, but there is monitoring available for that. And I think that that's really key to keep in mind. You know, your personnel that are out on the road in the vehicle that has got your logo on the side, the general public doesn't care about the gross vehicle weight rating. They're just going to see, you know, who it is that's advertised on the side of the vehicle. So keeping that monitoring in place for anybody operating on the road with your logo, I think is really crucial. All right. So let's see if I can unpack this question. So when the clearinghouse says no, even if the MVR says yes, you can't use the driver. Okay. So if the clearinghouse says that there's a, you know, if that driver is disqualified per the clearinghouse, they're disqualified, period. They are going to have to go through the return to duty process necessary to regain their status of being available for safety sensitive duty. The MVR might look good, but that's really an irrelevant subject at that point. If the clearinghouse says no, then the driver is disqualified from being able to operate safety sensitive duty. Let's see here. Somebody has mentioned that there is a 3-month card that can be issued. Yes, there is a 3-month MVR or medical certification card that can be issued. We don't see them issued here very often. And honestly, if somebody gets issued a 3-month card, their general fitness for duty is pretty tentative. So we don't see that happen very often. Most of the medical examiners that are putting things across our desks are more likely to give that 6-month card. But yeah, certainly it is possible to issue a 3-month card. Question came in here about a DOT MIS report. So let me just get back to what is an MIS report. The MIS report is essentially the documentation on your ability to have complied with the 382 drug testing requirements with regard to testing your drivers. 50% of your drivers should be tested annually for drugs and 10% for alcohol. The MIS report is going to be providing data on that process so that you can prove you've done the right thing. And certainly if HireRight's serving as your TPA, we would be able to generate that report easily for you. If you go actually into your HireRight user interface, there is a way to run that report yourself. It's part of the management tools or the reporting tools that can be found on the left-hand side of your user interface. If you're coming to HireRight from some other process and you're not familiar with that interface, certainly just let us know. We can get you instructions, or you can always contact customer service here at HireRight and they can pull that up for you as well. One more question, I think. Let me just read it here real quick. So one of the questions here, and I'll try to bring it down a little bit, is just pertaining to driver consent in the clearinghouse. So when drivers, when you order a clearinghouse query, that driver is, if it's a full query, must go into the clearinghouse proper. That's nothing that HireRight controls. The driver has to go into the clearinghouse, must issue a release through that clearinghouse before HireRight is allowed to extract that data on your behalf. Now, there is an amount of time that driver is going to be given from HireRight's perspective. We are working with you as the employer and engaging that driver as well with notification that, hey, you need to go into the clearinghouse, you need to issue that consent. And after we've done, I believe it's 4 notifications, we're going to back off and say, we're not able to connect to that driver, and we will go into a process to actually dismiss that order, at which point, yes, if the driver does contact you, you'd have to reinitiate that order. But we have to clear that out at some point. Otherwise, we will simply have, too many things open-ended to keep track of on our side and also for your side as well. One more look here. And I do have a few questions here which we're going to take, and I want to answer them a little more precisely to some folks who have some specific questions. So those I will get to in some email responses. I think this has been hopefully a good conversation for you here today. I'll give you a few minutes back of your day. But before I do that, first of all, I want to appreciate you. I want to thank you for being a customer with HireRight. Truly do appreciate your business. Appreciate all of the time that you've spent with HireRight over my career here. And want to wish you each a very Merry Christmas, a very happy holidays, and certainly to a prosperous 2024. And with that, we'll give you a few minutes back in your day so that you can go get a fresh cup of coffee and get back to work.